Forget everything you think you know about nuclear deterrence in Europe, the comfortable assumptions that have guided NATO strategy for 3 decades, the reassuring briefings from think tanks and defense ministries, the carefully constructed narrative that tactical nuclear weapons are essentially unusable political instruments sitting in storage waiting to be forgotten. Throw all of it out. Because what happened in the past 72 hours at the Zebrovka Air Base in Gomel Oblast is not a symbolic gesture. It is not a diplomatic signal. It is the repositioning of live nuclear warheads to a forward staging location that puts Warsaw under a 6-minute flight time. And the governments responsible for defending the people of Poland, the Baltic states, and Eastern Europe either do not understand the magnitude of what just occurred, or they understand it perfectly and are praying you do not. Having spent decades in military intelligence, having analyzed nuclear postures from both sides of the Iron Curtain, having sat in rooms where the unthinkable was war-gamed until it felt procedural, I am telling you now with complete clarity that what we are witnessing is not escalation theater. This is not Vladimir Putin rattling a saber for negotiating leverage. This is operational repositioning of a category that changes the mathematical reality of any NATO military planning scenario in the Eastern Theater. The next thing I'm going to walk you through is going to be deeply uncomfortable. Stay with me because the details matter more here than in almost any topic I have ever analyzed. Russia's tactical nuclear arsenal, as distinguished from its strategic warheads, comprises approximately 2,000 deployable weapons, according to the most credible open-source assessments drawing from Federation of American Scientists data and the Arms Control Association. These include air-delivered bombs carried by Su-34 and Tu-22 M3 aircraft, sea-launched cruise missiles, ground-launched Iskander-M ballistic missiles capable of carrying either conventional or nuclear warheads, and short-range artillery shells. The critical distinction between tactical and strategic is not yield, although tactical weapons are generally lower yield, ranging from sub-kiloton devices up to approximately 100 kilotons. The distinction is delivery, range, and targeting doctrine. Tactical nuclear weapons are designed to be used on a battlefield. They are designed to destroy armored formations, command centers, ammunition depots, airfields, and port facilities within a theater of operations. They're not city busters in the traditional sense. They are war-fighting tools. The Iskander-M system, which is the primary delivery platform now confirmed inside Belarusian territory, has a range of approximately 500 kilometers in its conventional configuration. The nuclear variant designated the Iskander-M with the 9M723 ballistic missile maintains the same airframe with a nuclear re-entry vehicle replacing the conventional warhead. From launch sites in Gomel Oblast, which sits in southeastern Belarus, approximately 50 kilometers from the Ukrainian border and 350 kilometers from Warsaw, the flight time to the Polish capital is between 5 and 7 minutes, depending on flight profile. To Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania and a NATO member state, the distance is approximately 430 kilometers. To Riga, Latvia, under 600 kilometers. To Tallinn, Estonia, under 700 kilometers. Every NATO capital east of Berlin is within operational reach of systems now confirmed deployed to Belarusian territory. What the mainstream media will not tell you is that this repositioning did not happen in isolation. It happened in a specific sequence that anyone with operational planning experience recognizes immediately. 3 weeks before the confirmed nuclear repositioning, Russian and Belarusian forces conducted Zapad-adjacent exercises specifically rehearsing dispersal and concealment of dual-capable missile systems in forested terrain. The Belarusian road network in Gomel and Brest Oblasts has been quietly upgraded over the past 18 months with reinforced bridge structures capable of handling the 42-ton transporter erector launcher vehicles that carry Iskander systems. Storage facilities at Zebrovka, which had been inactive since Soviet dissolution, received construction activity detectable through commercial satellite imagery beginning 14 months ago. This is not improvised. This was planned, resourced, and executed with the deliberate methodology that Russian strategic planning historically demonstrates when it intends something to be permanent rather than temporary. Before I walk you through what this means for NATO planning, I need you to understand something about warning time that fundamentally changes how you should be thinking about this situation. During the Cold War, NATO's nuclear planning assumed warning times measured in hours for strategic strikes and 30 to 40 minutes for theater-level nuclear use. Those assumptions drove everything: the dispersal protocols for aircraft, the hardening requirements for command facilities, the alert postures for air defense. Modern ballistic missile flight times at tactical ranges collapse that calculus entirely. At 5 to 6 minutes from Gomel to Warsaw, no functional warning system exists that provides meaningful response time. The Polish Air Force cannot scramble. Ground-based missile defense interceptors require more than 3 minutes simply to receive launch detection data from satellites, compute trajectory, and bring Patriot batteries to engagement readiness. The mathematics are simply not favorable. Here is what actually happens in those NATO planning rooms when they model this scenario, and having been connected to enough of that community to understand the operational picture, the question is not whether the Iskander warheads can reach their targets, because they can. The question is whether NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, which currently involve B-61 gravity bombs stored at Incirlik in Turkey, Aviano in Gedi in Italy, Buchel in Germany, Kleine in Belgium, and Volkel in the Netherlands, provide any meaningful deterrent response in a sub-10-minute exchange scenario. And the honest answer, however uncomfortable, is that gravity bombs dropped from dual-capable aircraft like the F-16 and the modernized Tornado require significantly longer to generate and execute than a pre-positioned Iskander volley. The asymmetry is structural and it is severe. Stay with me, because what I am about to explain is the piece of this that transforms a troubling development into a genuinely civilizational concern. Russia has not simply moved weapons. Russia has altered the decision calculus for every NATO contingency planner operating in the Eastern Theater. Before this repositioning, the deterrence equation rested on the assumption of roughly symmetrical response timelines. A conventional Russian attack on Baltic state territory would trigger NATO Article 5, which would initiate a response sequence that included, at the extreme end, nuclear options. The implicit assumption was that the timeline for this sequence allowed for political decision-making, for escalation control, for the kind of back-channel crisis management that characterized Cold War confrontations. Those assumptions no longer hold. What the Pentagon does not want said openly at press briefings is that the combination of Iskander-M positioning in Belarus, the confirmed hardening of storage facilities there, and the parallel deployment of Russian S-400 air defense systems to cover Belarusian airspace from Polish and Lithuanian air corridors represents an integrated anti-access and area denial package that specifically neutralizes NATO's ability to project conventional air power into Belarusian territory during a crisis. You cannot destroy what you cannot reach, and you cannot reach what is covered by layered S-400 coverage with Pantsir S one-point defense systems filling the engagement gaps. I have watched this pattern play out in different geographies before. The combination of forward-deploying nuclear-capable systems, covering them with integrated air defense, and selecting sites with minimal warning time to primary adversary capitals is a specific operational template. It was applied in Kaliningrad years ago with respect to the Baltic approaches. It was applied in Crimea with respect to the Black Sea theater. Belarus represents the third iteration of this template, and each iteration has been more comprehensive than the previous one. This is not improvisation. This is the systematic application of a strategic architecture. The reality that no formal NATO briefing will address publicly is the question of what Poland does now. Poland has spent the past 4 years executing one of the most aggressive conventional military buildups in European history, acquiring 250 M1A2 Abrams tanks from the United States, 980K 2 Black Panther tanks from South Korea, F-35A aircraft, HIMARS rocket artillery, and the Korean K-239 Chunmoo multiple launch rocket system. Poland's defense budget has reached 4% of GDP, the highest proportion in NATO. General Wisław Kukula, the chief of the Polish General Staff, has publicly described building a force capable of sustained high-intensity conventional warfare. But here's the strategic reality. None of that conventional capability addresses the nuclear positioning problem. You cannot buy your way out of a 6-minute warning time with more tanks. Let me walk you through exactly why this matters for the next phase of what is about to unfold. The question now in Warsaw, in Vilnius, in Riga, in Tallinn, and most critically in Brussels and Washington, is whether NATO needs to respond to this repositioning with a counterpositioning of its own. And that conversation is genuinely dangerous because the options available are limited and each carries escalatory risk that previous European security crises have not confronted directly. Option one is accepting the repositioning and absorbing the deterrence asymmetry as a new baseline, which is politically and strategically untenable for Eastern member states who are now under direct nuclear threat. Option two is repositioning United States tactical nuclear weapons eastward, bringing B-61 bombs to Polish or Baltic territory, which would be the most dramatic change in NATO's nuclear posture since German reunification, and would constitute exactly the kind of eastward nuclear expansion that Russia has explicitly characterized as a red line. Option three is pursuing accelerated conventional air defense deployment to eastern territories that theoretically complicates Iskander employment, which is technically marginal given flight time constraints, but politically achievable without formal nuclear escalation. I take no pleasure in saying this, but there is no clean answer here. Anyone who tells you there is a straightforward deterrence response that restores stability without escalation risk is either ignorant of the operational details or is managing your perception of an extremely dangerous situation. What I have not yet told you is where the economic dimension of this begins to intersect with the security calculus in ways that European governments are desperately hoping their populations do not connect. The repositioning of nuclear systems to Belarus carries an implicit message about gas transit, grain supply chains through Ukrainian territory, and the vulnerability of critical infrastructure serving European markets. Iskander systems at Gomel do not only threaten Warsaw, they threaten the Druzhba pipeline infrastructure in western Ukraine. They threaten the rail corridors through which European economic activity with Ukrainian markets flows. They threaten the logistics nodes in southeastern Poland through which military assistance to Ukraine has been routing for 3 years. This is an integrated, coercive package, not a single-dimension military deployment. The great power competition dimension compounds every element of what I've just described. China has observed this repositioning with interest that goes beyond passive analysis. Beijing has been watching whether Russia's nuclear signaling in Europe produces meaningful NATO behavioral change without actual weapons employment because that data directly informs Chinese calculations about Taiwan contingency planning. If forward nuclear positioning in Belarus successfully constrains NATO's willingness to continue supporting Ukraine at current levels, without a single warhead being used, without a single missile being launched, then the deterrent utility of similar positioning in the South China Sea or near the Taiwan Strait becomes considerably more attractive to Chinese strategic planners. What is happening in Belarus today has direct implications for what happens in the Pacific in the decade ahead. Keep watching, because the next part is where this truly becomes a question about the international order rather than a regional security problem. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Framework, the arms control architecture built over 50 years of difficult diplomacy, the New START agreement that expired without replacement, the INF treaty that no longer exists, all of this created a scaffolding within which nuclear postures were at least partially observable, constrained, and subject to diplomatic management. That scaffolding is now comprehensively dismantled. Russia's Belarusian positioning occurs in an arms control vacuum that has no precedent in the nuclear age. There is no treaty mechanism for transparency. There is no agreed baseline for what constitutes stabilizing versus destabilizing nuclear posture in European territory. There is no hotline protocol specifically addressing tactical nuclear positioning disputes of this type. The institutional architecture that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of opacity does not exist anymore. Decisions are being made right now as we speak in NATO defense ministries about how to respond to imagery intelligence that has confirmed this repositioning. The analytical picture is clear enough that alliance planners know what they are looking at. What remains deeply uncertain and what will determine the trajectory of European security for the next decade is whether political leadership across the alliance possesses the strategic coherence to respond in ways that restore deterrence, stability, without triggering the escalatory spiral that the repositioning was presumably designed to provoke. History does not provide reassuring precedents for the ability of democratic alliances to maintain strategic coherence under exactly this kind of pressure. The next 48 to 96 hours will be revealing. Watch whether NATO issues a formal response through official channels or whether the alliance attempts to manage this through quiet diplomatic communication. Watch whether Polish leadership makes public statements that go beyond standard solidarity language to specifically address the nuclear dimension. Watch whether the United States European Command issues any force posture adjustments, because those adjustments will be visible through publicly available tracking of military movements, and they will tell you far more about how seriously Washington is taking this than any press briefing will. Watch whether there is any movement toward emergency NATO consultations under Article 4, which allows members to call for consultation when they believe their territorial integrity or security is threatened. What happens in the coming days will echo for decades. I have been in enough situations where the window for managing nuclear risk was narrower than anyone understood at the time to know that the comfortable assumption that someone responsible is handling this is precisely the assumption that history most consistently punishes. What I am obligated to tell you as someone who has spent a career analyzing exactly these situations is that the margin for error in the current configuration is smaller than it has been at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is not hyperbole. That is an operational assessment based on the geometry of warning times, the absence of arms control frameworks, the degradation of back-channel crisis communication mechanisms, and the internal political pressures on all sides that make de-escalatory choices costly for leaders who cannot appear weak. The clock is running, the window is closing, and what comes next is genuinely uncertain in ways that should concern every person watching this.